No one wants the government to shut down. Well, except for a few House Republicans.
I would never like to see a shutdown, but if that's where it's going, that's where it's going.
But with the government shutdown seeming virtually imminent this weekend, what does it mean for you? Well, the government funds and provides many things for U.S. citizens, including financial aid, disaster relief, and employment, with Axios recently reporting that most American adults agree that a shutdown would affect them. For the more than 2 million civilians employed by the federal government, the threat of this shutdown has been looming over their heads for weeks, with their worries of being furloughed or not receiving pay about to become a sad reality. And while Congresspeople responsible for the shutdown will continue to work and be paid, workers at government-funded recreational facilities like national parks and the Smithsonian Museum will not be able to work during the shutdown. Other employees like air traffic controllers and TSA agents will be required to continue working but won't receive pay. In previous shutdowns, this meant low staffing for these vital airport tasks, which could result in long lines and delays for travelers in the coming weeks. Like these airport workers, active duty military service members will also continue working without pay, while hundreds of thousands of the Department of Defense's civilian workforce would be furloughed. And although the USPS is a government department, it's not government funded, meaning that the mail will not be directly affected by the shutdown. But what will happen to the general public? Many U.S. citizens will be somewhat insulated from the effects of the shutdown in the immediate future, with programs considered necessary like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid continuing to run like normal. However, financial aid in the form of SNAP benefits that help feed 42 million Americans with food purchasing assistance, 12.5% of the population, will only be funded through October. So if the shutdown lasts longer than that, recipients will face, as U.S. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack said,
there would be some serious consequences to SNAP. The WIC program that I talked about today, which is for nearly 7 million moms and children, that program expires, if you will, or stops immediately when the shutdown occurs. We have a contingency fund at USDA that might continue it for a day or two. Some states may have leftover WIC benefits that have not been spent, which could extend it for a week or so in that state. But the vast majority of WIC participants would see an immediate reduction and elimination of those benefits, which means the nutrition assistance that's provided would not be available.
For FEMA's critical life-saving services for disaster victims, the department will have to rely on the money remaining in its primary fund, which could potentially be depleted depending on the length of the shutdown. So with these crucial services and Americans' jobs and livelihoods on the line, how long will the shutdown last? And why is it happening in the first place? Well, the US government has gone through 21 shutdowns since the 1970s, and this next one is set to be its 22nd, as well as the 4th in the last 10 years. Although some have lasted just a few days, the longest recorded shutdown happened just a few years ago, starting in late 2018 and lasting for 34 days, finally being resolved in January of 2019. And although government shutdowns have usually been centered around disputes between opposing parties holding the presidency and Congress like we have right now, this current shutdown is different. It's a result of Republicans in the House failing to agree on a spending plan, with hardline conservatives like Matt Gaetz and Tim Burchett opposing their leader, Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy.
There's only one person to blame for any potential government shutdown, and that's Matt Gaetz. He's not a conservative Republican, he's a charlatan. And as far as I'm concerned, when you're working with Democrats to try to vacate the Speaker, you're a joke.
You have more than 4 members of your own conference who are going to vote against any stopgap measure. Why continue to try to convince them to go along with you when they are saying that they're not going to go along with anything you bring on the table?
And although the Senate had provided its own bipartisan spending bill to the House in an attempt to avoid a shutdown, McCarthy rejected it, instead pushing forward to try to get Republican-led bills passed.
We passed 3 appropriation bills: defense, state, and foreign ops, and homeland security. In all, we have 4 appropriation bills done. There's 12 overall to get done. It's the discretionary spending every year the government is supposed to do. We have now in the House passed more than 70% of the discretionary spending on appropriations.
This week, the White House has released several statements urging Congress to push through a continuing resolution plan to keep the government temporarily open. And politicians from both sides of the aisle have continued to speak to the press on their stance concerning the shutdown.
When it comes to possible government shutdown, I would just say this. First, we hope it doesn't happen. From the perspective of the State Department, we're very focused on making sure that no matter what happens, we can focus our resources on advancing and protecting the national security, and of course, making sure that we can carry out the functions necessary to do that, to protect human life, property, and security. Our work would clearly be affected by this. It would make it harder to do everything that we do to try to advance national security. So we urge Congress not to take this step.
Our troops deserve so much better. And the House fails to fulfill its most basic function. If it fails to fund government by tomorrow, we'll have failed all our troops. Our service members will keep upholding their oaths, showing up for work, standing sentinel around the world, keeping our country secure, but they won't get paid. It's a disgrace.
Look, I'm going to do everything I can to ensure that it doesn't. I don't think there's any question. The only people who get hurt here are the American people. I respect some of the differences that some of my colleagues have with respect to spending, with respect to process. But in some cases, like with Matt Gaetz, it's a difference of personality. And he's made it very clear that his objective is to remove Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. And so this has become a situation where the American people are going to be harmed because of one person, Matt Gaetz. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to stand by and let that happen. We've tried to give the Speaker as much runway as possible here to get a conservative CR onto the floor, continuing resolution, so that we can keep the government funded and be in a position to negotiate with the Senate. If it fails today, there are a number of us that will move ahead without them, because the bottom line is people's lives, people's economic livelihood is at stake. The stock market, 401ks. It's totally unacceptable to be playing politics as Matt Gaetz has been throughout this entire 3-week period. And I'm not going to let it happen. Well, there's a number of ways forward. Number one, I and 31 other Republicans are part of the problem solvers. We signed on to a bill that would be a bipartisan stopgap measure for about 3 months to allow us to complete the appropriations process work. Nobody in the Republican conference disagrees about the need to cut spending. Nobody in the conference disagrees about the need to do single subject appropriations bills. We all agreed to that. But the bottom line is it's going to take more than tomorrow's deadline of September 30th to pass these bills and get them signed into law. And so in the interim, we need to keep the government funded and open.
It's a terrible thing to have a shutdown, but I'll tell you what's worse is if our whole economic system collapses. We're taking in about $5 trillion this year, and we'll spend about $7 trillion. So this economic model that we're in right now is just not sustainable. And I dare say that if the economic system completely shuts down, that'll do more than it'll be a little more than discomfort. I think the folks back home understand the fact that we're up here trying to do something, and the conservative folks that I'm one of and the people that I represent understand that we're keeping our word. We are going to make this country fiscally sound if we can, and that's what this is all about. You know, we want to have single issue payment bills. We don't like the CRs, continuing resolutions, because that's just a gimmick. It's a 30-day CR, and then leadership will tell us we need to pass another CR so we don't have to pass any more CRs. And that's like telling a crackhead, look, I'm going to give you some more crack to get you off of crack, but because this country is addicted basically to our great-grandchildren's money. And this is the process, and that's why we're going through this, so we won't have to go through this again.